Okay, here we go again for another week in conservation ecology. We're going to be talking about the last few main threats that I want to cover in this class of why biodiversity is declining. Today we're talking about pollution and overexploitation. So far we've already covered a number of major threats to biodiversity, including land cover change, including the loss of connectivity and the loss of habitat in general. For species, we've talked about climate change, we've talked about invasive species. So today, two more key threatening processes to species, pollution and overexploitation. That's just summarizing what I've just said, and that we've already covered these ones, and now today we're going to be talking about pollution and species overexploitation. So if we take a look at the different kinds of reasons why species are declining, we find that for certain kinds of species, it'll be different kinds of threats, and that will differ between different places. And for some species, overexploitation and pollution are in fact quite important, and especially in some settings. So mammals are amongst the species that are a bit sensitive to overexploitation, you can see worldwide here, and especially in some locations, so they can be quite sensitive to things like overexploitation. In China, for example, this is vertebrate species. In China, a lot of different things are used as food, so as a result, that is a relatively bigger threat here than in the rest of the world, than in the United States in this case. Whereas, for example, habitat loss is a relatively bigger threat in the United States than in China. So different places will have slightly different threats affecting species. Pollution, interestingly, here is also listed as a bigger threat in the US than in China for vertebrate species in general. Anyway, the point here is that overexploitation especially can affect mammal species, and we'll look at why a little bit later. And pollution is also something that, depending on where you are in the world, can be a significant threat to species. We're going to start with pollution, initially looking a little bit, at just a tiny little bit really, at the history and some of the types and roots of pollution, and then some of the effects of pollution. So let's look a little bit at history. In 1962, Rachel Carson published a book that was going to be critical in the birth of the environmental movement. The book Silent Spring. In Silent Spring, she warned that we would have a silent spring, meaning a spring without the sound of birds, if we continue to use the pesticide DDT the way it was being used. DDT is a pesticide that was poisonous for vertebrates and especially caused eggshell thinning in birds. So as a result, when birds were basically trying to brood their eggs, the eggs would actually break, and of course then you have no offspring. So this was a critical moment in the history of the environmental movement, and also sparked through basically a pollutant, DDT in this case, a harmful chemical substance in the environment. DDT is now banned in many countries around the world, but it still continues to be used in some locations. Another little bit of history, in the 1970s there was a lot of talk about acid rain deposition. Acid rain results from sulfuric and nitric oxides in the atmosphere, which come from industry especially. So basically industrial emissions lead to certain gases in the environment, and that can lead to deposition of basically the chemicals that cause a different sort of acidity, and then can lead to basically pollution, which can kill trees. So this was tried to be rectified a little bit in the late 1970s through a convention on long-range transboundary air pollution to regulate pollution a little bit more than before. So the harmful substances from industry in this case were key pollutants that actually led to massive rates of forest dying off. Another relatively famous example is that of the ozone hole, which is less so a biodiversity story at this point, but still interesting to note that here the ozone layer, which protects, and we're talking here about ozone in the stratosphere. So stratospheric ozone is the ozone we want. Tropospheric ozone is the stuff we don't want. That's actually increasing from pollution. And so when people are saying sometimes in summer ozone levels are very high, don't go outside, that's about the troposphere. But in the stratosphere, we need the ozone layer in order to protect us from UV radiation. The ozone layer was depleted very much through the use of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which were used in refrigerators and spray cans. And that led to the discovery of the ozone hole over Antarctica in particular in 1985. Then the Montreal Protocol that was decided upon in 87 led to the phasing out of these CFCs, and as a result then the ozone hole was gradually able to heal, essentially. So this is a success story of combating a global pollution problem, and sometimes it is being referred to in the context of, well, look, we can do global things, but one key difference to the current climate change problem, for example, I digress a bit, but never mind, here was that there were substitutes available. So other substances were available that we could use in our refrigerators and our spray cans, so it was possible to phase this out without a lot of drama. For global climate change right now, we sort of lack a good commercially viable substitute for the greenhouse gas producing substances that we're currently burning. So a little bit of a different story. Anyway, the point here very briefly is that there have been other global pollution problems and some of them have been resolved. Generally speaking, there can be different types of different types of pollution, as we've seen already from these examples, intentional and unintentional. So there can be accidents, but there can also be intentional types of pollution. We're going to talk a little bit more about air, soil, and water pollution over the following few slides. So the types of pollutants you might have are quite diverse. They include fuels. I'll mention an example of an oil spill in a moment. Agrochemicals are a big one. We've already talked about DDT there. Pharmaceuticals are an increasingly major concern. And as you probably know, those of you taking chemistry classes, we have people here in the faculty who are interested in pharmaceutical pollution in the environment and especially in water. This is a very important issue that also affects biodiversity, as I'll show in a few slides. Heavy metals, persistent organic pollutants, and also nanomaterials and plastics. So some of these I will talk a little bit about on the following few slides. Let's start with a classic example of an oil spill, just to get a sense for the huge flow-on effects of an oil spill that an oil spill can have. So in 1989, the Exxon Valdez basically had a major oil spill with something like 41 million liters of oil leaking out in Alaska when this accident happened. This affected something like 28 different types of environment in terms of animals, plants, different kinds of, these kinds of things shown here, different kinds of communities or species, habitats. 28 different ones were affected here. It was a very large oil spill, and interestingly, less than 10% of the oil that spilled at the time was actually recovered. So the vast majority of the oil that went out into the environment basically stayed there. And some of that oil still has not been sort of biodegraded up until today. So it has had a major effect. We can see a timeline here, how initially there has been a major effect on lots of things. There are some species and habitats that have since then recovered. By the way, they're using habitats in the way that it's not a species-specific concept here. In fact, I don't even know where they're using habitat here at all. Designated wilderness, for example, they consider a habitat. Anyway, you know my opinion of this. That is basically not really correct. That is a kind of designated environment by humans. Habitat is a species-specific concept. That's just my personal little hobby horse, so don't worry about it. The point here is that different communities were recovering, and it takes a very long time, even after such a spill. 20 years later, some of these communities are still recovering. Some of them we just don't know what's happening, and some of them appear to simply not be recovering very well at all. Agrochemicals are another huge one globally in both terrestrial and aquatic environments. So after 1900 or so, the invention of the so-called Haber-Bosch process allowed the artificial manufacturing of fertilizers, of synthetic fertilizers, which boosted agricultural production in a major way because many plants are limited in their growth by nitrogen. So if you can add nitrogen to your fields, a lot of plants will grow better than they otherwise would. And that's all very nice, but essentially that nitrogen ends up in lots of different places. It ends up in the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, nitrogen oxides, ammonia. It ends up leaching into the ground, into water. So there are various ways in which this is basically traveling through the environment. We have intended flows initially, where we're trying to sort of we're manufacturing fertilizer and we're putting that onto our fields, and we're maybe also using it between, we're putting some of that to animal dung we're putting onto fields. So some nitrogen cycling here is intended, but a lot of it is coming from this manufactured fertilizer and is then going as unintended flows, which are shown on these other arrows here, as unintended flows to elsewhere in the environment. That in turn has major effects on environments. So we have nutrient loadings per hectare here, and essentially we have different kinds of excess loads of nutrients around Europe, we can see here, and depending on where you are in Europe, either places are really being over-fertilized a lot or not so much. So depending on where you're looking, where agriculture is extremely intensive, we end up with extremely high nutrient loads in terms of brought into the environment through agrochemicals. That leads to many problems for terrestrial systems, but also for aquatic systems. So aquatic systems are also negatively affected through high nutrient loading, causing eutrophication, and in some extreme cases a sort of hypoxia, where the environment essentially tips into a different kind of not very livable state for many different species. So aquatic systems can also very much be affected in both rivers, lakes, and in the oceans, actually, by agrochemicals. This, in turn, is very much then related. So this is that was the story of fertilizers. Now we can also look at pesticides. That's the other kind of main agrochemical. So if you have pesticide contamination, that can also affect lots of different communities, including in the water. So highly contaminated streams, in this case, you can see have fewer macroinvertebrates than slightly contaminated or not contaminated streams. And you can see a similar thing here for the species number as for the family number. So basically, with pesticides, we have a similar kind of story with different mechanisms, of course, than for fertilizers. So both kinds of agrochemicals, artificial fertilizers and pesticides, are very harmful. The third main one that comes from human use, but also substantially from agriculture, is that of pharmaceuticals. So pharmaceuticals are used by people, and of course when we take certain pharmaceuticals, some of this is processed by our bodies, but some of it we actually excrete when we go to the toilet, and some of it actually ends up in our water systems and travels through the environment this way because we're not fully using it. And that changes things in lots of different ways. So I'm just trying to see what the examples are here. We can't read the text very well. Well, let's not worry about the detailed examples. I guess the point here is that it travels through many different places. And there are various ways in which these kinds of pharmaceuticals or other substances can accumulate in species through processes of bioaccumulation, especially in fatty tissues in the species. Certain substances can accumulate and then lead to various problems. So I mentioned human use of pharmaceuticals, but then there's also pharmaceuticals being used for things like livestock, and this can also influence species such as, for example, vultures, and we come to an example of that on one of the next few slides. So these are the main some of the main top 10 pharmaceuticals used and the number of countries in which they have been found in aquatic environments. So diclofenac is the leading one here, but others that are well known to us as well are ibuprofen, for example. Now paracetamol we also know well. I don't know many of these. Estrone is related to hormones. Sulfametho something is an antibiotic. So we have different kinds of pharmaceuticals here that end up in the environment. So antibiotics, painkillers, anti-inflammatory drugs, those kinds of things. Also hormonal drugs like we might use in contraception, for example, also end up in the environment. The result of which is that we can see in the world here the number of pharmaceuticals detected in surface water, groundwater, tap water, or drinking water, and actually, especially in the industrialized nations, there's quite a bit that can be found there. Lots of different pharmaceuticals can be shown to exist out in the environment in the places that we drink. Less so in some of these poorer places, but then again, well, there are less pharmaceuticals being used, but I'm sure they also do a lot less testing of their water here, so I would be a bit careful about these statistics. Biomagnification, I mentioned before, so in the fatty tissues of species, essentially some of these substances can accumulate and then be carried through the whole food web. So you can find, for example, that toxins enter, in this case DDT, enters the food web and then travels through the environment and accumulates to different extents in the fatty tissues, such that you have particularly high accumulations somewhere higher up in the food chain. One particularly dramatic example, or two dramatic examples actually on this slide here. One of them is the use of diclofenac. Diclofenac is an anti-inflammatory drug. It is used by people, but it's also used in the livestock industry. And in the livestock industry, it has caused major problems for vultures that ultimately feed on dead livestock. So if a cattle dies somewhere, then basically a bunch of vultures, in India this was shown, come and eat the carcass, and as a result vulture populations throughout India have crashed, have really crashed in a very bad way, such that 99% of the vulture population in South Asia was wiped out in the 1990s. So it's extremely toxic to vultures and eagles, this diclofenac, and causes changes to the intestines of these birds. So diclofenac has basically led to this massive collapse. We see the number of nests here in 85, 86, 87, 97, 98, 99. So we have had this massive decline here in the number of nests because of this drug diclofenac in the environment. Another really dramatic example is, and sort of a slightly scary one, I think, is that because of the of hormonal contraceptives, the pill as it's called, because people are taking this, a lot of the basically estrogen levels in water increase, and as a result of that you can have changed sex ratios in things like fish species. So as a result, of course, if you have a changed sex ratio, you have increasing numbers of females, then ultimately you end up with a sex ratio which is essentially not viable, because you end up with too many female fishes and not enough male ones. So this can actually happen. I find this picture here incredibly confusing. We could now try to study it in depth and see if I can make sense of it. I can't right now, so I apologize for the fact that it's in here, but the main point is that the actual sex ratio of fish species can be affected by estrogen in waterways which are used by fish, by people. Well, estrogen which is used by people and ends up in waterways, there, like that. Okay, persistent organic pollutants are basically organic compounds that are quite resistant to environmental degradation, because through normal sort of processes. And because they are so persistent, there are now measures in place to try to severely restrict their production and their spread. There's a convention on this, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants from 2001, I think. So this group of chemicals essentially was intentionally or unintentionally produced through human activities. It's organic, meaning carbon-based, and it can also accumulate and be transported, and one of the problems is, and it accumulates at colder latitudes, but one of the problems with this is that it doesn't really degrade. So you've produced this stuff, you're stuck with it for a very long time, or even for a very long time. Yeah, and like I said, the Stockholm Convention from 2001 was essentially trying to put rules into place to phase out or to put measures into place to stop the spread and the production of these very harmful pollutants. Pollutants can also occur at a more local range directly, or when it comes to the spread of these pollutants. Let's have a look at an example here. How we've now talked about the general effects of agricultural pollutants, agrochemicals, and nutrients, but how do they spread? So one of the interesting examples is that actually wind can make a difference. So we can see here agricultural fields in this particular study are shown in green, and frogs present in blue, frogs absent in red. So we see that the winds, which is shown by arrows, the winds go away from the coast towards inland here. I think it's a coast. I don't know if it's a coast. Well, anyway, they go this way, and basically on the side with less wind or less wind coming from the agricultural fields, you end up with more frogs in both examples here, and on the side that is affected, that comes on the wind side of the agricultural fields, you end up finding very few. So frogs absent both for this species and for this other species here. So they are obviously being affected by the transport of pollutants through wind at a local landscape scale. So this is also quite interesting, and it's something other than the spread through water. Wind can also spread some of these things, sometimes called fertilizer drift, through the landscape. Another one that we hear a lot about, especially in the media over the last year or two actually, is the issue of plastics and very small pieces of plastic in the ocean. So small pieces of plastic are found throughout the world now in the oceans and accumulate, of course, in things like seabirds and fish species and so on around the world as well. So accumulation of plastic in the environment, another one of those things that doesn't really degrade very well, or very, very, very slowly only. And again, we find the evidence of that having long-term effects on the environment, essentially. So lethal effects, the sort of lethal dose is often called when 50% of a particular tested population die. That's called a lethal dose. But you can also have sublethal effects, for example, hormonal disruption, like we've shown on one of the previous slides. So the effects can be far-reaching, they can be global, they can be local, they can be global, like we've shown through the ocean examples, or the persistent organic pollutants. So these can spread at a global scale, not just locally. And then, of course, all of these things, as always, can have additive and synergistic effects with other threatening processes such as climate change or disease. So that's all I want to say about pollution. Now let's talk a little bit about the issue of overexploitation. There too, taking a little bit of a historical look, looking at why we might be overexploiting certain populations of species, give some examples, and I won't actually talk very much about the idea of sustainable harvests. So yeah, forget that point there. Overexploitation. So essentially, you can take things out of the environment at a certain rate as long as it reproduces at the same kind of rate. So typically in natural systems, there's a sort of co-evolved exploitation, adaptation to exploitation. So for example, there are different ways in which predator-prey type systems kind of co-evolve in such a way that ultimately what you end up with is something that fluctuates through time, but is sometimes sustainable over longish times. That's the result of co-evolution. When you throw in people to this mix, and the people especially target things like long-lived and slow-growing species, then those species are very sensitive to extra mortality. So basically, if people come and say, oh, we really like to harvest elephants, well, elephants are not quickly going to co-evolve to then reproduce more quickly. So it's especially these long-lived, slow-growing species that are going to have a difficult time keeping up with any kind of not naturally evolved, like predation, basically, which is what exploitation is. So megafauna extinction is known to occur, for example, due to climate change. We know that after the Pleistocene there was a mass extinction of large vertebrates, but then there have also been extinctions that have been not climate change related. So for example, human exploitation in Australia was likely partly related to the loss of some megafauna in Australia. So actually this picture seems to show that only in a very kind of vague sense, but there's behind my picture, which you can't see, there's another drop-off here. So the last little bit of drop-off that is taking place in megafauna is not climate related, but rather is related to the arrival of humans. So it's the megafauna, the large, long-lived, large-bodied species that are attractive to humans for hunting. In Australia, for example, they were attractive. So some of them died off because of things like climate change, but then others died off at the end through human arrival, because they can't quickly adapt to additional levels of exploitation. If we take a look at the global distribution of extinct megafauna species, we can check this picture here. So megafauna genera here are defined as species above 40 kilos in weight. Black is the proportion of those that have gone extinct, and gray is the proportion of those that are still around. And we're finding hugely unequal numbers of megafauna extinctions around the world. What's notable is especially that Africa has a very small amount of extinctions of megafauna so far, of actual full extinctions, and people think this is because of the long co-evolution of humans with large animals in this part of the world. Still there, extinction is of course only the end point. We talked about this before. Before you have extinction of a species, you have declines in populations, and we can certainly see declines of populations in various different species. For example, the range of the African African elephant here, it has massively declined through time, even though it's not gone extinct. Because people are targeting not necessarily all individuals equally, overexploitation can also lead to not just population reduction, but also to a restructuring in the population. So particular sizes might be specifically targeted in exploitation, or particular sexes and so on. And this can change the populations and restructure what's left. We find that, for example, in fisheries, by the way, we find this a lot because people want to catch large fish and not small fish, as an example. In fisheries, we also find a lot of side effects of exploitation. So there's basically physical disturbance, for example, through things like dredging, which means you're scraping something along the ground of the sea floor, and that changes the environment. And there's also a lot of sort of bycatch, when you don't actually really want to target a certain species, but there's incidental take bycatch. Blast fishing with dynamite is a particularly destructive method also, where basically, you basically blow up stuff and dead animals come to the surface, including the ones you wanted, but also including a bunch of other ones that you weren't particularly targeting. So some of the fisheries methods are particularly destructive. And large fish communities in particular, so species of large fish have been particularly affected. So this is the catch here of different kinds of predatory fish communities in different fisheries around the world, and we see basically a massive collapse over the last 50 or so years in many fisheries around the world. So most of the world's fisheries are now fully exploited or overexploited. Size selectivity I mentioned earlier. One of the challenges is that harvesting often reduces the larger individuals first, but those are of course the ones that are reproducing and producing offspring. So if you specifically get rid of the large ones, you end up with a problem in terms of producing more offspring. And you have the opposite pattern there for natural mortality, which is mainly affecting smaller bodied individuals, as opposed to mortality from fishing, which is largely affecting larger bodied individuals. As the populations of species are declining, you can have a thing that's called functional extinction. So basically species are in the environment and are changing the environment, but that can have a... Oops, hang on. I just need to pause for 1 second. Okay, I'll stop this video and upload a second one that continues this lecture in just 1 second. Thank you very much.